Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU Radio Hofstra University to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. Today with our guest expert, we'll be demystifying drug costs. We'll be touching on how drug prices have changed, who regulates them, and what impact they're having on patients and health systems. My guest is my colleague, Dr. Onisis Stefas. Dr. Stefas is a PharmD and is the Chief Pharmacy Officer for Northwell Health. Onisis, welcome to Well Said.
Thank you so much, Ira. Thank you for having me today. I really do appreciate it.
So before we get into the crazy world of drug pricing, just feel like it's appropriate to ask you how you've been doing through the crazy times that we've been all living through because of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Ira, for asking. Thank goodness myself and the family, we're all healthy and we're doing well. I mean, as you know, it's been, an unbelievable 18 months. But thank goodness everyone is good and starting to see some hope with the vaccines and everything else. So, yeah, doing okay. And Ira, how about yourself?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. Yeah, we're doing fine. And I do want to take advantage of the fact that you mentioned vaccines. You're an expert in drugs. I never want to miss an opportunity to plug the efficacy and safety of the vaccines for COVID-19. Anything you want to say as a drug expert about these vaccines?
Sure. I mean, so as we've seen now, as millions and millions of people have received the vaccine, that has been proven to be safe and effective. And it's very important to get your vaccines and also get your booster 6 months after, when appropriate. Also, glad to see that we are starting to have the younger population, 5 and older, also receive vaccines right now as well. And it's also important not only to vaccinate yourself, but your children.
All right. That sounds great. So we've done lots of shows about COVID and about vaccinations for COVID. But today I want to talk about drug prices. And I think this kind of came to a head, or at least became something that people started hearing about a few years ago, I think, when there were a bunch of headlines about drugs, some of which have been around for years, had dramatic increases in their retail prices. I'm thinking about EpiPen, the thing that people use for severe allergic reactions, increases in cost for insulin, which is a critical drug for people with diabetes, and even some older and oddball drugs like a drug used for treating parasitic infections. That probably led the pack with some astronomical increase in price from $13 a pill to $750 a pill. Were these just sort of isolated incidents, or is this really a trend in terms of drug pricing?
Yeah, so Ira, unfortunately, we have seen an increase in drug expenses, overall year over year. And a lot of these increases are really driven by new medications to market, particularly specialty medications like cancer and autoimmune diseases, single-source brands or generics like the Daraprim that you're mentioning, that went from like $13 to $750 a pill. These are the things that have really been driving expenses up. There has been some instances where we've seen decreases. So if you take a look at generic medications over the last couple of years, based on the number of manufacturers that are out there, for a particular medication, you will also see some drug decreases as well. And then we're also optimistic about biosimilars. As more and more biosimilars come into market, we're hoping that will start to bend some of the specialty cost curve as well.
So we'll talk about each of those things in turn, but I want to start with what you mentioned as one of the drivers, which is this idea that there's only a single source for the drug, meaning there's only one manufacturer that makes it. Is the implication there that a drug company is free to charge whatever they want for a pill that they produce?
So drug companies can charge, whatever the market will allow. There are very few mechanisms in place to control expense. So right now, currently, Medicaid has instituted rebates at the state level. So if a drug increases over traditional inflation, there are rebates that need to go back to those particular states. But Medicare and other payers, unfortunately have not instituted that. What happens in the United States is we have something called a best price model. And what that means is that the drug manufacturer needs to give their quote-unquote best price to government payers, so Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA. This sounds good in theory, but when large organizations like ourselves go to negotiate with a manufacturer, they'll say that this is our floor price, based on our best price that we give to the government. But unfortunately, that price gets set by the manufacturer. So there really is not a lot of ability, to control those drug prices in the market, particularly for drugs that don't have any competition.
So when you say best price, it's really just means the same price, but it doesn't necessarily mean a good price.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also mentioned that one of the drivers of increasing drug costs is new medications. Could you discuss the role of patents for drugs and how that plays into the pricing of new medications?
Sure. So if you take a look at the drug pipeline of new drugs that are coming out to market, well over the majority of those drugs are classified as, specialty medications. So they'll use like the newest technology. There'll be biologic medications, etc. And a lot of times they're treating, cancer, autoimmune diseases, rare conditions, and they really drive a very, very high price. So this year actually was the first time where specialty drugs as a category was the highest spend across the U.S. over traditional brand drugs and generics.
What's the role of a patent in driving the price of a drug? And could you explain to our listeners what drug patents are all about?
So when a new drug comes to market, it's issued a patent or exclusivity. So for a period of time after it comes out in the market, could be 10 to 15 years, nobody else can make that medication. So the manufacturer of that medication is the only one that can make it. And if there's no competition or very little competition in the market, or if this new drug provides, better, clinical benefit, etc., they get to charge whatever, the market will allow them to charge. And there's really no competition. So that's why you'll see very high drug prices. And then also, as drug starts to go close to coming off a patent, you also see additional increases in that drug as well, just so that manufacturer can maximize their profitability before competitors come into the market.
When you say as much as they can charge, what's pushing back? What stops a manufacturer from charging just some outrageous, absurd price for whatever they come up with?
So I'll give you some examples. So, for example, when the PCSK9s, those are cholesterol medications, when those new type of cholesterol medications came out to the market, they were very, very expensive. But a lot of the insurance companies didn't want to pay for them or didn't make them readily accessible on their formulary because there were other cheaper medications that were available to treat to treat cholesterol. So it really depends on, what is the therapeutic class, what are the competitors in the market. And then there are organizations out there like ICER, which basically will quantify the potential benefit of that medication and put a drug price on it. Now, what they're doing is recommending what the drug should cost. They have no ability to impact the cost of that drug. But a lot of the payers will look at that to see what is the perceived value of that medication, and from there they can make a determination on if they're going to put it on their formulary for people to buy and at what level of the formulary they're going to put it on.
I see. So when you say how much the drug ought to cost, you're talking about, maybe it saves people from hospitalizations, or it eliminates the need for a costly operation, or it prevents symptoms that would be debilitating. And so lots of organizations try to figure out what that's worth and then make a recommendation about what the drug ought to cost.
Yes, that's correct. So an example could be when the Hep C drugs came out, right? For hepatitis C, there was no quote-unquote cure. Then there was these oral products that came out like Sovaldi, which was $1,000 a pill. But if you take that medication, once a day for a total of 3 months, you ultimately cure yourself of hepatitis C. So, they justified that very expensive cost by saying that you're now going to be eliminating having hepatitis and decrease the chance of a liver transplant or something else, downstream. So they were able to justify the price. But going back to that high-cost cholesterol medication, it was a few $1,000s when it first came out. There was a benefit over the typical, generic Lipitor, Zocor that you were taking. The organization did not see that benefit should equal the additional price it would cost for that new medication, and therefore had a very slow uptick of adoption of people taking it.
Right. So there are some market forces that through insurance companies and other means tend to push back a little bit on these drug prices, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, if there's other competition within that therapeutic class, right? So, and it's like any other market conditions. If there's other options out there, they weigh against those options, and then from there, a decision, would be made.
Yeah, I mean, the cholesterol drug is an interesting case. As a cardiologist, I know that it was very difficult to get an insurance company to approve the coverage for those new drugs because, as you said, the drugs that we have already are pretty effective and substantially less expensive. So I guess that's a pretty good example of market forces at work. Let me ask you to make a kind of international comparison. I mean, it seems that the United States relies a lot more on these sort of market forces to try to control drug prices. But if you look around the world, we seem to be paying higher prices for drugs than just about anybody. Do you think that that's the case? And if so, why is that?
So I do believe that we pay, I think in some cases you'll hear 2.5 times more than other, wealthy countries that are out there. And, there's a couple of different reasons. The main reason that a lot of folks point out, including myself, is the ability for the government to directly negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. They don't have this best price model that we were discussing earlier. They're able to do direct negotiations. And I feel that if we were able to do so, at least for our government payers, right, our Medicare, Medicaid, VA, et cetera, I think that would dramatically be able to reduce the price. And then kind of eliminates this best price kind of idea, where then also large health systems and payers can also do better negotiations as well.
Now, the sort of party line among pharmaceutical manufacturers is that if they got a lower price for their drugs, let's say the situation that you just described existed and the government were able to negotiate more aggressively or at all for drug prices and got them lower, the drug companies say, well, that would stifle innovation because we need these high prices to get the return on our investment for doing the research that comes up with new drugs. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I do believe that we need to pay for innovation. Absolutely. I believe that innovation and discovery is extremely important and necessary function of drug companies. And there should be dollars, that are allocated and passed through on the price of a medication, and not just for the innovation that came to market, but also the failed innovations that didn't come to market. And there needs to be incentives. But, with that in mind, there may be ways to reduce the overhead of bringing a drug to market. It is very, very expensive to get a drug through the FDA. So, I think we need to look at, today, as you mentioned earlier, the pandemic, the age that we live in today, and all the tremendous innovation that occurred in a very short period of time. And we need to figure out how to keep this level of science innovation and reduction of price or reduction of expense going. In addition, I do hear also that, the U.S., supports or pays for a lot of the innovation that occurs. well, maybe there should be a more equitable distribution of those costs of innovation across the wealthy nations. So, yes, do I think that, part of that innovation should be passed along on the price? I do. But I do think it needs to be equitably distributed across the wealthy nations. And I also believe that even today in FDA trials and everything else that it takes to bring a drug to market, that there is a lot of inherent cost there that could potentially be streamlined to reduce the overall expense of bringing that drug to market and therefore decreasing that pass-along expense to the patient.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something really interesting there, that the price of drugs represents not just the price of the development of the drug we're talking about, but supports the drugs that didn't come to market. So do you have a sense of, of all of the drugs that are developed or molecules that are developed by pharmaceutical companies, like what's their track record? Like how often does it get to something that does lead to a marketable drug? Are we talking about, 50%, 5%? What's the batting average of a pharmaceutical company?
Well, over the majority of drugs that go through innovation or go to get approved do not. I don't have any exact percentages at hand, but it's very, very difficult to bring a new drug to market. It takes, many, many years for it to happen. And in the event that it doesn't, it's a huge expense that needs to be bared. But once again, that expense could be not just a U.S. expense, but a global expense.
Right.
As other countries are also benefiting from these new drugs to market.
You also mentioned that technology behind drugs is changing. So it's not just kind of molecules extracted from natural sources or synthesized, but whole new ways of creating drugs that are more expensive to manufacture. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So, to your point, the initial drugs were chemical compounds. There's active pharmaceutical ingredient, and they can easily replicate that. And those were the brand medications that you're familiar with today. And then when they cut off a patent, as we discussed, then generics come out to that drug. And once again, it's really like following a recipe. Then there was biologic drugs that came out. These biologic medications were derived from living tissue. So it's not something that, you're mining out of the ground or getting active pharmaceutical ingredient. And with that, to replicate it, what they do is they come up with something called a biosimilar. So when a biosimilar gets approved, it's a little bit different than an approval of a typical generic agent. It comes out, it gets approved, where it has to show that it has a similar, efficacy as the biological reference product to come out. So it's very complicated and very expensive. But that's why these medications are very expensive. And as more and more of these biosimilars come out and are able to kind of copy the process, then hopefully it'll help reduce expense over time. And Europe has been very successful in introducing biosimilars into the market and reducing some of those expenses, surrounding these very expensive agents.
And can you give us an example of what you mean by a biological agent? We're talking about things like antibodies and other complex molecules that are made by living organisms, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the most common one, and you've probably seen the commercials on TV, is Humira. Humira is the number one biologic agent, I believe, in the world at this time. It's very expensive. So we have Humira, which is very expensive, and we're looking forward to its first biosimilar potentially coming out as early as next year. But once again, it's coming from a living organism, and it just takes a very long time for these things to get replicated.
Yeah, and the biosimilar is not going to be chemically identical, but it has to prove that it works in exactly the same way. Is that what we're saying?
That is correct. It's got to go by each indication that's approved today by the FDA. By indication, it needs to go down for what it's used for, and they have to prove the same amount of safety and efficacy as the reference product.
That's a lengthy and expensive process in and of itself.
Yes, absolutely. And then most recently is gene therapy. and actually looking at specific diseases where there are gene anomalies, and working with drug manufacturers to produce gene therapies to reverse those effects.
Yeah, and those are really astoundingly expensive, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars for a single course of treatment.
Yes, absolutely. So we just had one the other day that was $2.1 million.
Say a little bit more about that, because I think people's jaws are probably dropping when they hear that a drug costs $2 million.
Yeah, $2 million. It's a one-time dose that a patient gets. It's for little kids that have a spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, and with this they can walk. So there's been some amazing innovation in the market where before these children wouldn't live past a couple of years of age and would be in wheelchairs.
Right. So it raises some really profound philosophical questions about literally what's that worth, right? I mean, a lifetime of disability can be averted with a one-time but super expensive intervention. Who decides what that costs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? The manufacturer came out with the pricing, and it's actually interesting because when you take a look at some of the manufacturers of these gene therapies, they're trying to come up with innovative ways to cover that expense. So I was listening to one of the manufacturers, I think it was last year or 2 years ago. It was almost like a mortgage on a house, where the insurance would pay over the course of 20 years because, people change insurances. So if you happen to have this insurance and then you have to get this medication and, God willing, you have insurance and you pay the $2.1 million and it's covered by the insurance, and then what happens in the next year or two if the person goes to a different insurance company, right? Now, this patient goes to this other insurance company, and the patient's already received this level of benefit. So there's talks now about potentially looking at the model to say, should that patient cover that expense over a period of time? And if they move to different insurance companies, should they also take on some of that expense? Because these very expensive medications obviously could bankrupt people, but can also bankrupt companies as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So to try to better align the people who are saving the expense that would have been associated with the lifetime care of a disabled person with the price up front of a super expensive drug. Well, that gets pretty complicated.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So let me go back a little bit to your role as the chief of the pharmacy services for a large health system. So you and your team are responsible for buying and stocking all of the drugs in all of Northwell's hospitals so that if a patient is hospitalized with pretty much anything and a doctor orders a medication, it's available for them to administer. I'm just curious, so how much money does your department spend each year on drugs, and how does that compare with the sort of total budget for the health system?
So we spend somewhere between $800 and $900 million a year on medication across the whole organization.
That's a lot of money.
In terms of, yeah. Northwell is a $14 billion organization. And if you take a look at, and obviously we're not-for-profit, so if you take a look, we carry a very, very, high expense.
What are your big ticket items?
So if you take a look at where we spend a lot of our money, it's really in outpatient infusion. So the outpatient infusion that will happen in hospital outpatient infusion areas like our cancer centers, infusions that happen within our physician practices, and then also our specialty pharmacy as well. Those are the areas that have the highest growth and expense.
Let me flip back a minute to the experience that sort of everyday individuals are having with the cost of drugs they were prescribed by their physician to treat all of their medical conditions. I'm thinking about high blood pressure, diabetes, and so on and so forth. What's driving the expense of rising costs of drugs that have been around for a long time? And I'm thinking specifically about about insulin. And maybe you could explain a little bit about what's going on in the insulin market and then try to explain why that's happening.
If you take a look at certain insulin products, for example, I guess like a drug like Victoza, I mean, that drug went up about 42% over the last, we'll say over the last 5 years. And a lot of the insulin drugs continue to increase over time. And, you know, it gets a lot of focus, and rightfully so, because, as you know, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you know, insulin is a life-saving medication. What's actually interesting is Eli Lilly did a little bit of an experiment. A couple of years ago, Eli Lilly came up with a generic Humalog product. And the way it works for medications is typically a brand or a specialty medication will have a rebate. So when your insurance company puts that on the formulary, there's the cost of the medication, and then there's a rebate that goes back to the insurance company, and sometimes it'll go back to the self-insured company or you know, the company that paid that insurance company, you know, that you work for. A few years back, Eli Lilly decided to come up with a generic insulin, and with the generic, it didn't have a rebate. But when you applied the rebate to the brand insulin, it was actually cheaper for the insurance company and cheaper for the company that the people work for to actually stick with the brand product, because there was a lower net cost after you took the rebate out. So even though they came up with a product with a lower list price, once the rebate was applied, financially it made more sense to go with the brand product. So a lot of insurance companies went with a brand over generic process there, where they kept the brand on even though it was more expensive because of the back-end rebate that the insurance was getting from the manufacturer.
The reason why that was good for Eli Lilly is what?
So I think Eli Lilly was just trying to understand that, you know, if there's lower prices that are in the market, then they're not able to yield these rebates, and that it shows that the market sometimes would prefer the higher price with the greater rebate on the back end than having a lower list price.
Yeah,
so
but
I don't
the problem
know if
there
one was than the other to Lilly. I think they were just kind of testing the market conditions to see what it would look like.
Right, but the net result is that for people who are uninsured, the price of these drugs is becoming really making the drugs unattainable or more difficult for them to take at the appropriate dose.
Absolutely. You know, as you know, we treat all sorts of people here at Northwell from various different socioeconomic settings and areas. And, you know, one of the things we struggle with the most is uninsured or underinsured patients on insulin. It's very, very difficult. You know, we do work with the government, we work with the pharmaceutical companies, and we figure out ways to subsidize the pricing. But insulin is definitely an issue of concern, because that is something that if you're a diabetic, type 1 diabetic, you can't live without.
Last question about that. I mean, insulin's been around for 100 years. Why is the price still high if there are generics available? It seems to me that insulin ought to be dirt cheap by now.
You're correct, Ira. It should be. But it's not. I mean, the class and the drugs that are out there, they keep the price high. And there really hasn't been a lot of competitors out in the market to lower that price.
Well, it's quite a mess we've gotten ourselves into here, and I want to thank you for helping us understand why that is and to explore some of these issues. So, Onisis, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ira. I appreciate it.
My guest has been Dr. Onisis Stefas. He is the Chief Pharmacy Officer for Northwell Health. For more information about this program and to find past episodes, please visit sites.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are welcome to send comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.